Hi, everybody. All right, now that you have seen Isaac and TJ's twisted, brilliant version of the Purim story, I want to take just a few minutes to tell you the story the way a little bit closer, perhaps, to the way it's been told for centuries. Obviously, I'm going to be telling it in English, and that's not the way it's been told in other lands and other places. But here's the story. It takes place about 2,500 years ago in the land of Persia, the Empire of Persia, actually, which is what we would consider today Iran. And this is in the period after the destruction of the first temple, when the Jews have been carried away from the land of Israel, first by the Babylonians, and end up in Persia when Persia conquers Babylonia. And most of the action takes place in the capital of Persia, which is a city of Shushan. In Shushan, there's a king. The king's name in Hebrew is Ahasuerus. The other main characters are the queen. The main queen of the story is Esther. Her uncle, Mordecai, the Jew. The villain, Haman. And I know you're out there. I hope you have something to make noise with. If you do, whenever I say that name, Haman, make as much noise as you can. I can't hear you anyway, so make as much noise as you can. All right, the story starts with King Ahasuerus throwing a party. And to this party he invites people from all over his empire, from distant lands, and the party lasts for 6 months. It's a half-year long celebration. At the end of the 6 months of celebration, he holds a 7-day blowout party. The king is having a party for the men in his palace, and the queen at that point, her name is Vashti. The queen is having a party for the women in her palace, and this king, Ahasuerus, one of his primary characteristics is that he loves to drink. And in his party, he has become exceedingly drunk, and in his drunkenness, he calls for his wife Vashti to come and dance for all of the men in his party. When Vashti, in the women's palace, the women's party, gets the word that the king wants her to come and dance for the men in the men's party, she refuses. The king, who is, even when he's sober, he's not particularly intelligent. He is a stupid king, and he's drunk. And when he gets the word that Vashti refuses to come and dance for him, he's completely baffled, just doesn't know what to do. And he gets advice from one of his advisors, who says, "King, if you allow this to stand, if you allow Vashti to get away with this, to refuse to come at your command, this will be a problem throughout the kingdom, because everywhere the women will refuse to obey the commands of their husbands." So this is an early story of women's revolution, a feminist uprising led by the Queen Vashti, and the king, at his advisor's recommendation, banishes Vashti. And the party kind of runs down to a quick end. And in the morning, the king wakes up with a terrible hangover, and he calls for Vashti, and they say to him, "Vashti's gone. You banished her." And so the king says, "Well, can somebody find me a new queen?" And he says, "And make sure she's pretty." He's not interested in smart. He's not interested in kind or generous. All he's concerned about is a pretty woman. And so the messengers go out throughout the entire empire looking for a beautiful woman to replace the Queen Vashti. The messengers come eventually. They travel through the entire Persian Empire. They come to the home to a Jewish home. It's the home of a Jew named Mordechai, who lives there with his niece, whose parents have died. His niece's name is Esther. And the messengers identify Esther as the right woman to bring back to the palace to marry the king. And Mordechai, they have no choice in the matter. And Mordechai, as she's leaving, gives Esther the instruction, do not tell anyone that you're Jewish. She's taken to the palace, and Mordechai follows, and he takes up his position outside of the palace, where he attempts to sort of keep an eye on things and know what's going on inside the palace. His niece is in there. While he is outside the palace one day, he overhears two people plotting. They're speaking a language other than Persian. We don't know what language they're speaking, but Mordechai apparently knows a lot of languages. He overhears the plot, and he reports the plot to the palace, and these two people who are plotting against the king's life are captured and they're hung. And it's recorded in the story of the life of the king. At this point, Esther is in the palace, Mordechai is outside of the palace, and at this point, a new figure appears on the stage in the story, and this man's name is Haman. Make noise. Haman is appointed as the king's prime minister. For whatever reason, the king elevates Haman to the most powerful position in the empire, and Haman issues an order, which is that whenever Haman goes out into the city, wherever he goes, people have to bow down to him. Most people comply. But one day, Haman is walking outside in the town. Everybody's bowing down to him, except for one person, and that is Mordechai. Haman doesn't even notice. But his servants do. And they go over to Mordechai and they say, why are you not bowing down to Haman? You know that's the law. And Mordechai explains to them that he's Jewish. The messengers come back, the servants of Haman come back. They tell Haman what's going on. This guy is not bowing down to you. He says it's because he's Jewish. And Haman is consumed with rage. And he becomes determined to punish not just Mordechai, but all of Mordechai's people, the entire Jewish people. Haman goes to the king. And he says to the king, Your Majesty, there's something I need to talk to you about. There's a certain people in your kingdom who do not follow our customs. They do not obey your laws. And they have these space lasers that they use to set forest fires all over Persia. And the king says, really? Space lasers? And Haman says, that's what I've heard. And the king says, what are we going to do? And Haman says, here's what we should do. I will contribute a tremendous amount of money to the royal treasury if you will let me take care of them. And by which he means do away with them. And the king says, Haman, keep your money. I don't need your money. Just do whatever needs to be done with these people. And so Haman issues a decree, has posters made, and they are displayed all over the kingdom, saying that on the 13th day of Adar, the Jews are going to be put to death because of their space lasers. The entire city, when they see these posters, is dumbfounded and silent, and the king and Haman sit down to eat. Mordecai, who's outside of the palace, when he hears about this decree against the Jewish people, he goes walking through the city and he lets out a huge, bitter howl. I once told this story and I howled at this point in a way that made the cantor jump out of his cantorial robes. Mordecai walked in the city and he howled, "Ah!" And when he sat down outside of the palace, he dressed himself in sackcloth and ashes. And the word got to Esther in the palace that there's a man named Mordecai sitting outside of the palace dressed in sackcloth and ashes. And Esther sends clothing down to Mordecai. Put on these clothes. Mordecai sends the clothing back to Esther. Esther sends a message back to Mordecai saying, "Why are you sitting out there in sackcloth and ashes?" Mordecai sends back a copy of the poster about the Jews being put to death. Esther sends back a message saying, "What are we going to do?" And Mordecai says, "You, Esther, are the only one who can do anything." And Esther sends back a message to Mordecai saying, "I can't do anything. Everybody knows that if you go and try to talk to the king without being summoned, the penalty is being put to death." And Mordecai sends a message back to Esther saying, "Esther, you are the only one that can save us. You have to go and talk to the king." And Esther sends back a message saying, "Okay, I'll do it." The next day she puts on, actually 3 days, she and her maidens fast and pray, and all of the Jews of the city, of the empire, are fasting and praying. At the end of 3 days, Esther puts on her best clothes, and she goes and stands at the entryway to the king's courtroom, his throne room. She stands there in the doorway. When the king sees Esther standing there in the doorway, he is blown away by her beauty. He raises his golden scepter toward her. And Esther approaches and she touches the tip of the golden scepter. The king says, "Esther, wow. What is it? What's your request? Why have you come?" And Esther said, "Your Majesty, I have a request." And the king said, "Up to half my kingdom, Esther. Half my kingdom. Ask whatever you want." And Esther says, "My only request is that you and Haman come to dinner with me tonight." The king says, "That's it?" She says, "That's it." And that night, they have dinner. The king and Esther and Haman. At the dinner, they're drinking, they're eating, they're laughing, they're singing. Finally, the king turns to Esther and says, "Esther, what is your request? What is it that you want?" And Esther says to the king, "Your Majesty, I'd like to have dinner with the two of you again tomorrow." And the king says, "That's it?" And she said, "That's it." They go home. Haman has never been in a better mood. He has never been in a better mood. However, when he's walking out in the street, he sees Mordecai there. Mordecai again refuses to bow down. And Haman, he had been so happy, but he's so mad. This brings us to that night. That night, the king has trouble sleeping. And he calls for whoever is out there to bring him some hot milk and to read to him the story of his life. When he's hearing the story of his life, he hears about the story of the two people who had been outside of the palace plotting to kill him, and how his life was saved by Mordecai the Jew. And he asks the person who's reading to him, did I reward Mordecai? What did I do to thank him? And the person who's reading doesn't say anything about it here. And so the king calls for Haman, who is outside of the royal bedroom, to come in, and Haman comes in. The king says, Haman, I need some advice. If you were me, and you really wanted to honor someone who has done you a huge favor, what would you do for them? And Haman thinks to himself, the king wants to honor somebody who's done him a big favor. It must be me. And he says, King, listen to me. If you really want to honor somebody, here's what you should do. Dress that person in your royal robe, with your royal crown, put them on your royal horse, and have them led through the city saying, this is the way the king honors somebody that he wants to honor. And the king says, Haman, brilliant, brilliant. I'd like you to do that for Mordecai the Jew. Poor Haman. He has to do it. He leads Mordecai through the city on the horse with the robe and the crown. And shouting, this is the way the king honors the one that he wants to honor. Next day, it's time for dinner again. And at the dinner, it's Esther, and it's the king, and it's Haman. And they're feasting, and they're drinking, and they're laughing. And at a certain point, the king turns to Esther and says, Esther, there's got to be something that you want. What is your request? And the queen, Esther, says, Your Majesty, I have one small request. My life. And the king says, what? And she says, my life. And the king says, Esther, you're not in danger. Who would be wanting to hurt you? Who would want to kill you? And Esther slowly turns to Haman and says, this man has decreed that my people shall be exterminated. I am a Jew. He has decreed death for my entire people. At which point, the king runs out of the room. And Haman falls on the floor, begging for his life to Esther. And the king comes back into the room and he sees Haman pleading with his wife. And he says, oh, I can't believe it. And he gives the command that Haman shall be strung up and put to death on the gallows that he had erected for Mordecai the Jew. And that is the story. Whatever you saw earlier, that's more of the story the way it's been told for 2,500 years.